Listen carefully. If you are hearing this message, it is not by accident. You didn't click this video randomly. You were guided here, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, something older than logic. There comes a moment in every chosen one's life when the noise fades, when the voices that once surrounded you go quiet, when the friends disappear, the messages stop coming, and the silence becomes so loud it feels unbearable. That silence didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, one unanswered call at a time, one broken connection after another, until you found yourself standing alone, wondering how everything changed so quickly. You began to ask questions you never asked before. Why am I alone? Why did everyone leave when I needed them most? Why does it feel like I'm walking this path by myself with no guidance, no reassurance, and no hand to hold? Those questions weren't signs of weakness. They were signs that you were approaching a threshold most people never reach. Here is the truth most will never understand. Your loneliness was never punishment. It was protection. Before we go any further, pause this video for 1 second and type these words in the comments. Not for me, not for validation, but for your spirit. I am chosen. Then like this video and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but as a declaration that you accept what God has already confirmed about you, even if the world refuses to recognize it. Because what you are about to hear will reframe everything you thought was rejection and reveal why heaven itself stepped in. Now, let's dive deeper, not into emotion, not into opinion, but into spiritual law. When God prepares someone for elevation, separation always comes first. Not everyone who walked with you was meant to go where you were going. Some people were assigned to a season, not a destiny. If they had stayed, they would have diluted your focus, distracted your discernment, and interfered with the refinement process. So they were removed. Not because you were unworthy, but because you were becoming too powerful to remain accessible to everyone. The isolation wasn't meant to break you. It was meant to strip you of dependence on external validation. In the silence, you learned to hear your own intuition. In the absence of applause, you learned to move without approval. In the loneliness, you discovered strength that only emerges when there is no one left to lean on. What you experienced was not abandonment. It was the final test. The test of faith without witnesses. The test of obedience without reassurance. The test of endurance without comfort. And you passed. If you are still standing, still seeking truth, still choosing growth over bitterness, that alone is the evidence. The season you're in now is not the end of the story. It is the calm before divine confirmation. What was removed will be replaced, but at a higher level. What was lost will return, but aligned. And what tried to break you will soon understand that the silence was not your downfall. It was your preparation. Number 1, the final test was isolation. There is a specific moment in the life of a chosen one when growth no longer comes through struggle, effort, or resistance, but through removal. And this is where the final test begins. Not the test of endurance, where you prove how much pain you can tolerate. Not the test of temptation, where you wrestle with desire. But the test of isolation, the most misunderstood and most decisive phase of all. Because isolation is not emptiness. Isolation is precision. It is the deliberate narrowing of your environment so your spirit can no longer be diluted. And when God isolates a chosen one, it is never because they are weak. It is because they are becoming too strong for their current surroundings, too aware, too clear, too aligned to continue absorbing the chaos, projections, and limitations of others, which is why you were not removed from people randomly, but extracted carefully strategically and quietly, layer by layer, relationship by relationship, until only what could no longer follow you was left behind. Every silence you experienced, every message that went unanswered, every door that closed without explanation was part of a spiritual filtration process designed to protect what was forming inside you, because noise would have distorted your next level of clarity, and familiarity would have slowed your obedience. The loneliness you felt was never meant to punish you or make you doubt yourself. It was meant to slow you down long enough to hear your own thoughts again, to feel your own intuition without interference, to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. And this is where most people fail, because they panic in the quiet. They rush back to distractions, validation, and false connections just to avoid sitting with themselves. But you didn't do that. You stayed. You endured the silence without numbing it. You allowed the discomfort to refine you instead of chasing relief. And that is why this was the final test. Because once you pass isolation, nothing external can control you again. Number 2. Why you felt lonely. Even when you were not alone. One of the most confusing experiences for a chosen one is feeling lonely while surrounded by people. Because this type of loneliness has nothing to do with physical presence and everything to do with spiritual misalignment, a quiet but persistent signal that your inner world has shifted before your outer world could catch up. You began to notice it subtly, not through dramatic moments, but through small internal reactions. Conversations started to feel repetitive, predictable, and strangely hollow. Energy exchanges that once felt normal now left you drained rather than fulfilled. And even when you smiled, laughed, or participated, something deep within you remained untouched, unengaged, as if your soul was no longer being spoken to. This was not arrogance, and it was not a belief that you were better than anyone else. It was awareness taking root, the kind of awareness that comes when God begins refining perception rather than changing circumstances. As your spirit grew, it became incompatible with environments that once felt safe and familiar, not because those spaces were evil, but because they were no longer aligned with who you were becoming. This is why being around people started to feel heavier than being alone, why solitude began to feel like relief rather than punishment. Your loneliness was not abandonment. It was information, a signal from your spirit that it could no longer shrink, perform, or dilute itself just to maintain connection. That discomfort was necessary because comfort would have kept you stagnant, but tension forced you inward, and inward is where your authority was rebuilt. In the quiet, stripped of distraction and validation, you began to hear your own thoughts clearly, to recognize God's guidance without interference, and to recover parts of yourself that had been suppressed for the sake of fitting in. This season was not about isolation for isolation's sake. It was about separation for alignment, because before God can elevate your external life, He must first strengthen your internal foundation, and loneliness was the training ground where your discernment, resilience, and spiritual authority were quietly forged. Number 3. Divine protection, disguised as loss. Many of the people who left your life were not enemies. They were risks disguised as familiarity. They had proximity to you, but not the depth, maturity, or reverence required to handle what you carry. Some enjoyed access to your presence without understanding the weight of your purpose. Others fed on your consistency, your listening ear, your strength, and your patience, without ever considering the cost it took to remain that grounded. God does not remove people to punish you, shame you, or isolate you out of cruelty. He removes them to protect the assignment placed on your life, because not every connection can survive elevation without turning into a liability. There are people who can walk with you in one season, but would sabotage you in the next, not out of malice, but out of limitation. That is why explanations were rare. That is why conversations ended abruptly. That is why closure never arrived in the way your mind wanted it to. Divine protection does not announce itself with comfort or clarity. It moves quietly. It creates distance before damage. You may have felt misunderstood, misrepresented, or falsely judged during the separation. That was not an accident. That misunderstanding served as a filter. Anyone who needed to believe a false version of you in order to walk away was never meant to witness the truth of what you are becoming. If they could only leave by shrinking you in their mind, then their presence would have required you to stay small in real life. God allowed the narrative to break so the assignment could remain intact. You were not abandoned. You were preserved. You were not overlooked. You were shielded. What is left could not sustain what is coming, and what is coming requires a cleaner, quieter, more intentional environment. This season is not about loss. It is about precision. What remains now has room to grow without interference. Number 4. God's silence was training, not absence. There comes a phase where God deliberately reduces external confirmation, and this moment is often misunderstood. Prayer feels quieter, not because heaven is distant, but because the noise of constant reassurance is being removed. Signs feel subtler, not absent, because your awareness is being sharpened. Guidance no longer arrives as dramatic signals from the outside world, but as a calm, steady knowing rising from within. This is not abandonment. This is maturation. At this stage, constant reassurance would have weakened you, not strengthened you. God was transitioning you from dependence to discernment, from needing repeated confirmation to recognizing truth without being told. You are being trained to trust what you already carry, the wisdom forged through years of endurance, correction, and quiet obedience. Faith evolves when validation disappears because real faith does not need to be proven every day to remain alive. Many chosen ones fail at this stage by demanding signs, asking for repeated proof, or panicking when silence arrives. They mistake quiet for rejection and delay for denial. You didn't. You stayed consistent, even when clarity felt delayed, even when answers did not arrive on your preferred timeline. You continued to move forward, without applause, without confirmation, and without emotional reinforcement. That endurance activated a shift. Heaven responds to steadiness, not urgency. Desperation repels alignment, but grounded trust invites it. This was the moment your faith became self-sustaining, no longer reliant on emotional highs or external validation. You crossed from borrowed strength into internal authority. What once needed constant reminders now stands on its own. You no longer follow God because of signs. You follow because you know. And from this place, guidance becomes clearer, timing becomes precise, and your path stabilizes. Silence did not weaken you. It refined you. Number 5, why you were forced into emotional self-sufficiency. You learned to self-regulate without comfort, and that lesson reshaped you at a depth few ever reach. When reassurance was absent, your nervous system learned to settle itself, not through avoidance, but through inner authority. You discovered how to breathe through uncertainty, how to remain present when no one was there to affirm your worth. You learned to move forward without applause, to take steps guided by conviction rather than validation. This was not accidental, and it was not punishment. This was preparation. Emotional independence is required for spiritual leadership because leadership at higher levels demands stability that cannot be borrowed from others. Where you are being positioned, emotional dependency would have made you manipulable, easily swayed by praise, fear, or the approval of crowds. Instead, you were trained to stand without leaning, to carry your own weight in silence and integrity. You were taught to listen inwardly rather than seek permission outwardly, to recognize the difference between intuition and noise. Over time, this rewired how you relate to the world. This is why you stopped explaining yourself, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. You realized that those who are meant to understand you will not need excessive words, and those who demand explanations are often seeking control rather than truth. This is why you stopped chasing understanding, because you learned that being misunderstood is often the cost of alignment. Silence became strength, not as withdrawal, but as precision. You began to speak only when your words carried weight. Detachment became clarity, allowing you to observe without being entangled and to respond without being reactive. You were not becoming cold, you were becoming grounded. Grounded in who you are, grounded in your purpose, grounded in an inner stillness that does not depend on external circumstances. This grounding allows you to lead without force, to influence without persuasion, and to remain steady while others fluctuate. What once felt like isolation now reveals itself as refinement. What once felt like abandonment now reveals itself as training. You are able to walk forward with calm certainty because you are no longer outsourcing your emotional stability. You're carrying it within yourself, and that is the mark of someone being prepared for responsibility that extends beyond personal comfort into quiet, enduring impact. Number 6. God's reaction to your endurance. Here is what most people never see and never understand. Heaven watches how you move when no one is clapping, when there is no validation, no applause, no reassurance that what you are doing even matters. God observed how you handled loneliness without bitterness, how you sat in empty rooms without allowing resentment to poison your spirit. He watched how you handled misunderstanding without retaliation, how you chose restraint over reaction, wisdom over ego, silence over the need to prove yourself. He observed how you handled long seasons of quiet without abandoning your values, without lowering your standards, without betraying the core of who you are just to feel seen. That response mattered more than you realize. Endurance without resentment is rare. Most people survive hardship, but they grow hardened by it. You did not. You remained soft without becoming weak, patient without becoming passive, disciplined without becoming cold. And rare endurance activates authorization. You were not just tested, you were verified. This was not about seeing how much pain you could tolerate, but about measuring your alignment when pressure tried to distort you. Authority was installed quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses, without announcements. Nothing dramatic happened externally because everything shifted internally. Your perception sharpened, your reactions slowed, your discernment deepened. Your presence became heavier without becoming loud. When heaven responds, it does not always announce itself with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it simply realigns reality around you. Doors begin to move without force. Resistance dissolves without confrontation. People feel you before they understand you. You notice that situations no longer drain you the same way. That is not coincidence. That is calibration. What passed through you did not break you. It structured you. And now, What comes next will recognize what was quietly authorized in the dark. Number 7. What happens after the final test? The next phase will feel different, not louder, not dramatic, but unmistakably calm, as if the noise that once surrounded your life has finally stepped back to let clarity breathe. Alignment will replace effort, and you will notice that things no longer require you to push, prove, or perform. Connections will arrive already respectful, already balanced, without you needing to explain who you are or what you deserve. Opportunities will not feel chaotic or rushed. They will meet you at your pace, steady and precise, as though timing itself has adjusted to your frequency. You will realize that you are no longer chasing anything, because what is meant for you can now locate you without resistance. What once ignored you will begin to observe you from a distance, not because you demanded recognition, but because your presence now carries weight, depth, and quiet authority. You will move with fewer words and more certainty, trusting your inner compass without the need for validation. This is what happens when isolation finishes its work, when solitude has refined your discernment and strengthened your core. You pass the final test, not by force, not by striving, not by trying to be seen, but by remaining steady when everything went quiet and no external reassurance arrived. You stayed grounded when applause was absent, faithful when results were delayed, and centered when the path felt empty. That steadiness reshaped you. It taught you how to stand without leaning, how to listen without fear, and how to move without urgency. This is the reward of endurance and alignment. Type it one final time, slowly, with full awareness of who you have become and what you carry now. I am chosen. Stay aligned, stay grounded, stay protected.